In 1887, the United States government made a promise. They said, "We will protect your land. We will manage your resources. We will hold your money in trust. And we will give you every single penny that belongs to you." That promise lasted 116 years before anyone was held accountable for breaking it. And even then, nobody went to jail. What happened to the money of Native American peoples across more than a century is one of the largest financial crimes ever committed by any government against any people in the history of the United States. And most Americans have never heard a single word about it. Here is what you need to understand first. When the United States government placed Native American nations on reservations, after taking their original lands by force or by treaties that were almost immediately broken, the government made a legal commitment. The land that remained would be held in trust. That meant the federal government would manage the land on behalf of Native people. And any money generated from that land, from timber harvesting, from grazing rights, from oil drilling, from mineral extraction, would be collected by the government and paid out to the individual Native Americans whose land it was. This system was called the Individual Indian Money Trust, and it was administered by the Department of the Interior, the same branch of the federal government responsible for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. From the very beginning, from 1887 onward, the system was a disaster. Not an accidental disaster, not a disaster caused by poor administration or inadequate resources. A deliberate and systematic disaster in which the United States government collected money that belonged to Native Americans and then lost it, mismanaged it, failed to account for it, and in many documented cases, simply never paid it out at all. How much money are we talking about? Estimates of the total amount stolen or lost or unaccounted for through the Individual Indian Money Trust System range from $2.4 billion on the conservative end to potentially $47 billion when you account for the full period of mismanagement and the interest that should have accumulated on funds that were never properly invested or paid out. Read that again. $47 billion. Belonging to some of the poorest communities in the entire United States, held by the federal government, and gone. Oil royalties collected and never dispersed. Timber revenues that disappeared into agency accounts with no record of distribution. Grazing fees paid by ranchers who used native land and never reached the people who owned that land. Mineral extraction payments that vanished between the point of collection and the point of payment. For over a century, Native Americans across the country received letters from the Bureau of Indian Affairs telling them their accounts contained amounts that bore no relationship whatsoever to the actual resources being extracted from their land. Some received nothing at all, despite documented extraction activity on their property. When they asked questions, they were given runarounds. When they complained, they were ignored. When they tried to see the actual account records, they were told the records did not exist, or could not be found, or had been destroyed. Then came Elouise Cobell. Elouise Cobell was a member of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana. She was also a banker, one of the few Native Americans in the country with the financial expertise to look at the Bureau of Indian Affairs trust accounting system and understand, in precise technical terms, exactly how badly it had been mismanaged. What she found was not sloppy accounting. It was not a few missing files. What she found was a system so comprehensively broken, so systematically inadequate across so many decades, that she concluded the only possible explanation was not incompetence, but intentional neglect. The United States government had simply never intended to properly account for money that belonged to Native people, because Native people had historically lacked the political and economic power to force accountability. In 1996, Elouise Cobell filed a class action lawsuit against the United States government on behalf of approximately 500,000 individual Native American account holders. The case was called Cobell versus Salazar. It became one of the longest-running and most complex class action lawsuits in American legal history. For 14 years, the case wound through the federal court system. Federal judges found the government in contempt of court. Not once, multiple times. The Department of the Interior was found to have destroyed documents, lost records, failed to comply with court orders, stonewalled discovery requests, done everything in its considerable institutional power
to prevent accountability for what had happened to this money. Judge Royce Lamberth, a federal district judge appointed by Ronald Reagan, presided over the case for years and made statements from the bench that are extraordinary in their directness. He described what the government had done to Native American trust accounts as a travesty. He used the word, a travesty of justice. He said the United States government had dishonored itself in its treatment of its most vulnerable citizens.
In 2010, 14 years after the lawsuit was filed, a settlement was reached. The United States government agreed to pay $3.4 billion to resolve the claims of the individual account holders. $3.4 billion. But here is the part that should make every American stop and think very carefully. That settlement amount was not based on a full accounting of what was actually owed. A full accounting was never completed, because the records that would have been needed to do a full accounting had been lost or destroyed or never properly created in the first place. $3.4 billion was a negotiated figure, not a calculated one. Many legal analysts who followed the case believe the actual amount owed was dramatically higher. The $47 billion figure comes from attempts to reconstruct what should have been in those accounts based on historical extraction records. And not a single government official, not one, was ever charged with a crime. Not one person at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Not one person at the Department of the Interior. Not one political appointee. Not one career bureaucrat. Not one person who destroyed documents. Not one person who ignored court orders. Not one person who presided over a system that failed 500,000 people for over a century. Nobody went to jail. Elouise Cobell died in 2011. 1 year after the settlement she had spent 14 years fighting for was reached. She did not live to see the distribution of the settlement funds to the account holders she had represented. She was 65 years old. The Blackfeet Nation honored her as a hero. The United States government awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously in 2016. A medal for someone whose government had spent 14 years fighting her attempts to recover money that the government itself admitted it owed. She once said something that has stayed with many people who followed this case. She said she did not do this for herself. She did it because every time she looked at her elders, people who had worked the land their whole lives and received almost nothing for it, she understood that someone had to stand up and say that this was wrong, even if it took forever, even if she never lived to see it through. The legacy of the individual Indian money trust scandal did not end with the Cobell settlement. It raised questions that have never been fully answered. Questions about how many other programs and systems, land management, water rights, timber contracts, mineral leases, continue to operate with the same absence of genuine accountability that allowed the trust system to fail for over 100 years. The Navajo Nation, the Lakota, the Blackfeet, the Cherokee, the Ojibwe, the hundreds of other nations whose members were part of this system, they did not receive justice in 2010. They received a settlement. Those are not the same thing. Justice would have meant a full and honest accounting. Justice would have meant criminal consequences for deliberate mismanagement. Justice would have meant systemic reform, guaranteed to prevent the same thing happening again. What they received was $3.4 billion divided among 500,000 people, an average of roughly $6,800 per person for over a century of theft. If this story made you angry, if it should have, hit like right now. This story deserves to be seen by every American who believes in accountability and the rule of law. Subscribe to this channel because every single week, we tell the stories that the history books leave out. The full, honest, uncomfortable truth about what happened and what is still happening to Native American nations across this country. Share this video. Share it with someone who thinks the injustices against Native Americans are ancient history. Show them the date on the Cobell settlement, 2010. That is not ancient history. That is yesterday. Comment below one word for how this story made you feel. I read every single one. Until next time, the truth matters, even when it is uncomfortable, especially when it is uncomfortable.